Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way.
Okay. You're watching Breakthrough News. This is the Freedom Side. I'm one of your hosts, Eugene Rania. I guess I'm here as always alongside my intrepid co-host, Rania Khalek, who I guess is a victim of load shedding.
Give it a minute.
Getting
the electricity. Sorry. You're welcome, Sanctions. Like, what a better way to start the show, Eugene, than a demonstration of the consequences of U.S.-led sanctions around the world than with my electricity cutting and then coming back on. It just was really funny. As soon as we went live, my electricity shut off, and so that's why I was laughing, because the timing is impeccable.
No, the timing is definitely impeccable. Yes, indeed. Well, either way, good to now have clarity that I am alongside my intrepid co-host Rania. As always, Rania, it's good to be back alongside you. We have a great show for you here today, as we always do, swinging around the world. Got all sorts of great content on Breakthrough News generally, which is why it's a great opportunity to remind you, that's all of you watching on YouTube, that you should go ahead and hit subscribe there just under our video. Then make sure you hit the bell so that you get alerts for the things that you subscribe to, so that you don't have to look very far at all for all of the excellent content that we are putting out here at Breakthrough News, including Dispatches with Rania Khalek. Rania, is there any other factors you would like to inform our audience about?
It's funny you should ask, because yes, there are, Eugene. So firstly, if you are watching our show right now, please make sure you hit that like button. It helps boost us in the algorithm. But also, if you want to support our journalism here at Breakthrough News, you can become a member of Breakthrough News by going to patreon.com/Breakthrough News, where you can access exclusive content as well as exclusive merch, including this very cool Breakthrough News mug that we're both showcasing for you here, which I love. Very happy to have this mug. But more importantly, you can help support independent journalism. That's more important than ever. Go to patreon.com/Breakthrough News. Eugene, I know you want to add something about some sort of carrier pigeon.
Wow. Just coming in hot today. But if you so choose to use a carrier pigeon to send a message to somebody somewhere, I guess it would have to be relatively close, that we are live here and that you can watch this fantastic show starting basically right now. Please do release the pigeons at this moment, or however else you might like to alert people, text message, phone call, knocking on a door in a very friendly way of a neighbor and letting them know it's a great show for them to be watching. We would love to have everyone who is following you following us here on the Freedom Side on Breakthrough News, and of course patreon.com/Breakthrough News. Shout out to everybody, and don't forget you can also donate right below here throughout the show if you so choose. So yeah, that's all I really had to add. You kind of threw me off there. I didn't know if there was other points I should be making, but I've lost them now. But either way, we will just plow.
So sorry.
No, it's okay. It's okay. It's okay. I
just love the carrier pigeons. It's like my favorite. It's like the best part of the opening.
Well, let me tell you, I've looked into carrier pigeons, so there may be more happening soon on that front. But that being said, trust me. Yep. We're gonna just move forward and move right into the show here. We want to discuss some budgetary matters, if you will, here in the United States. President Joe Biden has recently released his fiscal year 25 budget. Ironically enough, he's released it before the fiscal year 24 budget has even been passed, although that's supposedly happening at some point here today, but just gives you a sense of the dysfunction in the American political system. But it's a campaign document, and it speaks very much to the where we are right now in the politics of the country and where the president is trying to message things in order to win some votes here in the fall, as he's rapidly shedding support due to his facilitation of the genocide in Gaza, among many other things. We are very honored to be joined as we get into this topic by Dr. Ben Becker, the editor-in-chief of Breakthrough News. Dr. Becker, thank you so much for joining us, sir.
Thanks for having me.
Well, we're in sort of a weird situation where the president has actually released a budget for essentially next year, fiscal year, so this fall, before they've even passed the budget for this year, the last several, I guess, 9 months or so. So it's kind of a complex and a weird situation. And in a way, I guess that's my first question is, what does this say about the state of the American political system that, you can't even pass a budget before the year is up? In terms of, I think, what a lot of people are looking at, which is the gridlock and stasis in Washington.
Well, as we know, the founders of the country wrote the Constitution so that Congress would basically be a place to generate useful Twitter videos and investigations of each other. I'm pretty sure we're fulfilling the letter and the spirit of the U.S. Constitution, because that's exactly what U.S. Congress currently does. They basically pass no laws. In some ways, maybe that's not such a bad thing, because the laws they pass are so terrible that you could almost argue that having a do-nothing Congress is preferable to a highly productive one at this point. But it is an indictment of where the system is as a whole, that basically each party uses its control of its one or another chamber to launch, dozens of investigations of each other and each other's donor networks and so forth. But very few laws ever get passed. The budget is supposed to be the one where, you have some sort of compromise and harmony, because nobody wants the government to shut down. Every time any budget gets passed, we're basically at the verge of a government shutdown. And they have these ongoing, continuing resolutions, which are, again, supposed to show that maybe there's a spirit of bipartisanship. But in fact, they just use these continuing resolutions to basically impose more budget cuts on the working class to keep the whole thing going, basically to maintain the status quo. So, I think that's pretty much where Congress is as a whole. The budget is the one area where you also can sort of avoid the filibuster, as Donald Trump very clearly showed when he passed massive tax cuts, 51 to 49 in the Senate. So I think there's also this indictment of the Democratic Party, which is, every time the budget comes up, it creates what it considers a wish list that it thinks is going to drive enthusiasm. And then they can turn around and say, well, the Republicans blocked us. And so there's this amazing degree of political theater surrounding every budget. The fact that you could propose a budget and it would be seen as a campaign document, and you could say that sort of uncontroversially, really says a lot. That's where we are.
I want to just because the fact that you said it's a campaign document. Biden was in New Hampshire on Monday this past week, and he's quoted in the New York Times as saying, this is the most Biden comment ever: "I'm not anti-corporation. I'm a capitalist, man. Make all the money you want. Just begin to pay your fair share in taxes." And he's always like, come on, man. I hate the way he talks.
So wholesome.
But all that's just, it's very wholesome. It's very, I take the Amtrak to work, man. But all that said, obviously this is a lot of campaign fluff. But one thing I find interesting, and this is not to take away from the budget, but just the fact that, I've been reading a lot throughout the week, articles about Biden struggling in the polls and trying to use the economy to get voters excited about voting for him in November. And it just doesn't seem to be working so far. And all these people are writing about it, and they're just like, gee, I don't understand. He's created all these new jobs and people are upset about him. And they'll just be like one sentence about, there's some, people who are upset about Gaza, but they'll just kind of like brush that aside as just a little thing. But it does seem to me like, yes, this is campaign fluff. Obviously, like, he's talking about things we would like to see more spending on social programs, even though he's a capitalist man. But in the backdrop of all this, there is this genocide happening that a lot of people do really care about. And it doesn't seem like this tax stuff about, and this campaign fluff is actually going to work to excite anyone when their social media feeds are just still full of images of babies torn apart by American-funded weapons for Israel.
It's not disconnected from the budget at all, Rania. I mean, when you lay it out like that, the way they were able to keep the government from closing a few days ago was to pass one of these continuing resolutions. And one of the deals between the House Republican leadership and Biden was to make sure that no additional funding in 2024 goes to the UN rights, the UNRWA that serves Palestinian people. So this is the main UN agency that is feeding and housing in shelters like the majority of the 1.5 million refugees in Rafah right now. And the Biden administration makes, as its compromise, just takes it off the table. Doesn't seem like it even had any big fight about it. You know, that $100 million that were promised wouldn't be given to this agency. I'm not sure if I can still be heard.
We can hear you.
But
We can't see you. We can hear you.
Okay.
It's like radio.
I am the voice of Patreon.
You know, we just want to remind the viewers, I guess, patreon.com/breakthrough-news. I mean, look.
Well, as the editor-in-chief of Breakthrough, I fully support this message.
Yeah.
I don't fully support it over my face.
Wow.
Now he's just gone. That's yikes. Okay, here we go.
I was punished for talking out of turn.
Yeah. Sorry. Wow. I don't mean to laugh through this.
Okay.
It's just the visuals are impressive. Okay. Where were you, Ben? Sorry. You were talking about UNRWA and the Democrats.
It speaks to exactly the point you're making, which is, you know, you're actually enabling and deepening a genocide. You're accepting all the Israeli talking points. You're literally participating in the deliberate starvation of a whole people. And then you want to turn around and say, look, we're working with the Republicans and we're keeping the government open and we're getting things done, baby. And, you know, like all that kind of stuff. So it's actually, it shows again how out of touch the administration is with young people. I mean, yeah, the statement, I'm a capitalist man, that's out of touch also with a large number of young people who want to see a government that is more socialist inclined, or themselves, they consider themselves socialist. But I don't think the Biden campaign has much of a future with the key demographics that it needs to motivate and inspire to win swing states, so long as the Gaza genocide continues. And I think you're right that no matter what they do, they're not going to be able to take people's eye off of this unfolding genocide that they're seeing on social media every single day. I mean, perhaps if there was a social program or something that was truly transformative in this budget, that was like a real breakthrough, maybe that would change the story and change the narrative from a political standpoint. But he doesn't even have that.
No, I think it's an important point, you know, that you're raising because, you know, in a bid to try to get more young voters in the past, I mean, it started at the State of the Union, but it's really been ramping up in the past week or so. There's been a push by Biden himself and the Biden administration to try to put a big focus on quote unquote affordable housing, since, you know, most renters in most major cities who tend to be Democratic inclined voters, but even most homeowners or wannabe homeowners are struggling to find housing at a cost that's not just totally usurious. So, you know, it's an interesting fact because, you know, it speaks exactly to the point you're making, trying to speak to the demographics he needs. But then when you look at the budget itself, it doesn't really seem to carry through on what he's claiming he's going to do. And so, I mean, talk about that if you could, and maybe also just the general framework of how these things are sort of put out there sort of in the ether. Like, there is an affordable housing crisis and I'm doing X, but not really addressing whether X is even addressing the crisis.
Yeah, exactly. So, for instance, the big thing that he wants to campaign on this week is all about housing, as you're saying. And it's one of the biggest affordable housing budgets in history, blah, blah, blah. Similar to kind of what they did a few years ago with the biggest climate change bill in history, but, you know, not nearly enough to actually have a transformative impact on carbon emissions or the transition to renewable energies. So he always hits this sweet spot where he can sort of propose enough money to drive the Republicans crazy as if he's doing something radical, and then do not nearly enough to meet the scale of the problem or inspire enthusiasm for his own base. It's really emblematic of the entire Democratic Party approach. But for instance, if they propose $33 billion in repairs for public housing, well, the backlog of repairs for public housing are by a magnitude 2 or 3 times greater than that already. So like, okay, the greatest affordable housing fix in history means that 1/3 of the people with urgent repairs needed in public housing will get their stuff fixed in the next 10 years. Like, really? Instead of a massive investment in public housing, you know, almost no new public housing has been built in the country in decades. And so the way that they try to deal with the housing problem, which is, I would say, the number one problem that people are facing, the rent still is too damn high. And and those who are trying to buy homes are finding it extremely difficult to do so. You have hedge funds just buying up all the private single family houses all over the country. He's not waging war against the hedge funds, for instance, or imposing regulations. What he's saying is we're going to, again, sort of create incentives for first-time home buyers. It's all sort of out of the toolkit of the historical sort of pro-capitalist housing approach, or you give some vouchers, but even the vouchers are being cut. And the native reservations in areas, vouchers are actually being cut. So when you drill into the details of these things, there's actually a mixture of cuts and increases, but nothing, again, is really transformative. There's nothing about rent control at a federal level. There's nothing about, again, building new housing that is public housing. Because ultimately, if you want to take the power away from the big developers and the landlords who are jacking up the rents and the home prices, you have to have a counterpoint. You know, in healthcare, they say the public option. Well, there is actually no housing public option. Everything has to go through the landlords and developers. So that would be a big change. And, you know, it's, again, not meeting the scale of the problem. It's par for the course. It reminds me a lot of the infrastructure bill and the Build Back Better bill and all those different bills from a few years ago. This one is actually promising even less than those bills did. Remember in 2021, when Biden came in, he said, we're going to have, universal child care. We're going to relieve college debt, a whole suite of things, making the child tax credit permanent. We're going to raise the taxes on the very wealthy up, back to where they were before the Trump tax cuts. None of that happened. And basically, he attacked the progressives in his own party. He made them give it up. They very willingly gave up those same issues. They negotiated it away. They compromised it away. They whittled it down. By the time you got to the end of the process, there was very little of all those promises left, almost none. And yet then they still try to turn around and say they've had some historic presidency. So, in a way, we're at the very beginning of the exact same process playing out in 2024. But the promises they're making at the beginning of 2024 are worse and even less efficient than the promises they made at the beginning of 2021, at the beginning of his presidency. And I guess they're expecting we're all just going to forget about that.
And this is like the ongoing problem with Democrats too, among many others, because they start at this position of like basically having conceded, assuming Democrats actually stand for what they say they stand for, which I know they don't. But let's like be generous and give them that, right? Whereas Republicans are actually radical and not a good way. Like they're talking about right now, they've always talked about this, but now you have them talking about it again, increasing the retirement age for Social Security, for example, and talking about cuts to Social Security. So it's like you have this insane radical party that's like, yeah, let's cut everything and get rid of everybody's rights. And then the response from Democrats is so meager. It's like they're asking for even less than when they started with, and they don't even mean anything they're asking for. It's a recipe for moving further to the right on everything, is it not?
It is. And even if the population is moving to the left on a lot of key issues, the policies continue to move to the right. And Obama, of course, famously did this too with his budget sequester when he was in office, that basically a right-wing group can sort of force the Republican Party to take a hard line. And the Democrats are very willingly sort of allow the historic advances of the working class, whether it be Social Security, Medicare, and so forth, to be chipped away at. So again, when the Republicans put it forward and Biden says, we're going to fight the Republicans, we're going to stop them, we're going to protect Social Security. Well, no one can really believe that because they've never fought for it before and they have let it be chipped away at. And so I think it is the same pattern again. And yet the one thing they all agree on, I don't even have to say it. I'm sure all our viewers at home are yelling at the screen, war, war, war. They're going to agree again on over $100 billion for, if you combine Gaza, basically Israeli genocide of the Palestinian people, Ukraine war funding, and then border security. And of course, they disagree about the tactics, but they both agree that you need massive amounts of new militarization of the border, more border agents, more border technology, weapons, all that stuff, mass detention. They're both sort of competing for who can be the furthest to the right on these issues, while both sort of slinging mud at each other for weakening the border. So, you'd think that these were the main priorities of the US people if you were to look at a budget. When you think about a budget, you really think about your priorities. Like if you pulled out my bank statement and I spent, 85% of the time going out to restaurants, you would think, well, this guy's seriously a foodie or whatever. Like that's what he cares about. Or if you spend half your time going on ski trips, you're obviously a ski enthusiast. So if you look at the US budget, it's obvious these people are just war enthusiasts. They're weapons enthusiasts, and they are border security demagogues to boot. And basically, that's the one thing that they're going to unite around. They're each going to actually say that the other side is weakening, but they're both really working hand in glove with the weapons contractors. And I think we should just note, whenever we talk about the military budget, the official budget request is now up to $850 billion. And that's basically through proxy wars and U.S. Military bases that are all across the world. But if the U.S. were to directly engage in these wars itself and put its own personnel on the line, have ground invasions, the type of war that would come if, for instance, there were a war against Russia and China, we'd be talking about many trillions more. And then there have been studies from the Monthly Review and other organizations that say that there's really another $700 billion in military spending that's hidden in different agencies and classified differently. So the actual military and war budget is up to around 1.5 trillion already. So again, if we're looking at what a government's priorities are assessed on its budget, it is not public housing, despite the campaign promises of Joe Biden. It is not healthcare. It is not food or renewable energy. It's war, and it's the military, and that's despite huge numbers of people in both parties, blue and red states, saying they'd prefer a transition to a peace economy where your tax dollars actually go to your own communities rather than the weapons of destruction.
No, very, very well taken point, and a notable point as we consider the Ukraine war. That was one of the biggest fears that U.S. war planners had at the end of the Cold War, was that Americans would not want to support endless war against Russia and, in fact, would want to spend it on priorities at home. So think about that when you hear all the fear-mongering about Russia. But nonetheless, we'll have to keep covering as things keep going, as they bumble and stumble along throughout the campaign. Happy, as always, to have you with us, Dr. Ben Becker, the editor-in-chief of Breakthrough News. Wow.
Thanks.
Eugene, the look on your face. It's very serious stuff we're talking about. But I'm sorry, is everybody trying to troll Ben right now? Is that what that was all about?
No, I just made a mistake. I said he's the editor-in-chief of News something. I was wowing at myself. But he is, in fact, a PhD. He is a doctor. There's no trolling involved. He is, in fact, a well-earned.
Okay, I thought there was like some plan in the studio at Breakthrough News between you and like Matt to just troll Ben.
No, there's no
which
plan.
is probably what he thinks now. And that's okay. That's okay. It's good to keep people on their toes, you know?
Indeed.
But well, Ben is brilliant. I love having Ben on.
No, of course. Even fighting through it all. Nonetheless, we are going to turn our attention here to Latin America. There's a number of things that have been happening as it regards both Cuba and Venezuela, two of the key countries in Latin America. And we are very honored to be joined here on the show once again by Zoe Alexandra, who is a journalist and co-editor of People's Dispatch.
Hello.
Zoe, thanks so much for joining us. Sorry, there was a little background noise. I got confused. Sorry, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
No, it's very happy to have you as always.
It's like a speech happening in the. Oh, now it's gone. Now it's gone. No, it's not.
Okay, thank you. Nonetheless, thank you so much for joining us. Happy to have you as always. Maybe the big news to start with here is Cuba. I mean, in a way, it hasn't been a huge story in terms of the in terms of the mainstream media here in the United States. But obviously there's been some stories. There were protests that took place, Santiago, Cuba, one of the places, several other cities, in relationship to some of the economic hardships that are happening. Of course, Zoe, you always hear the normal stuff online from the people who hate Cuba, that this is a sign how it's a completely failed project that should be overthrown and so on and so forth. What is that narrative missing that people really should know here in the United States who are exposed to it so constantly?
Well, it's missing a lot of depth. It's missing a lot of information, of course. What's the real story here? On Sunday in the city of Santiago, in the eastern part of Cuba, people frustrated with the economic situation that they're suffering under right now in Cuba due to the over 60 years of economic blockade imposed by the United States government because Cuba declared itself a socialist project. And reeling under the past 3 years after the designation of Cuba as a state sponsor of terror, which has deepened and intensified this murderous sanctions regime against the Cuban people, against the island. This has, of course, had huge impacts in Cuba's ability to survive, to be able to import fuel, to be able to import medicine, to be able to import food. What is the impact of this, of course, on the people? This means that the people have less access to food, less access to all of the crucial supplies that they need to survive on a daily basis. So it's actually natural that these sort of spontaneous outbursts may happen from time to time because they're suffering under the boot of U.S. imperialism. Cuba, all it wants to do is engage in trade with other nations. But because of the designation of Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism, it cannot do financial transactions. It cannot, a lot of banks refuse to process money from Cuba, refuse to process transactions. There's so many different restrictions. It's impossible to even comprehend the impact that this blockade and designation has on the Cuban economy. Even the fact that they can't have machines that have over 30% of U.S. parts in them. It's really ridiculous. Every single possible area that the U.S. could restrict Cuba's economic development and growth, it does. And so in this context, there was this, spontaneous protest that happened. Local leaders of Santiago, the head of the Communist Party in the province, actually went out onto the streets. Other authorities, local authorities, went to meet with the people and discuss their concerns. Of course, they're also people of Cuba. They're not some removed, elite class. They're actually working people in Cuba. They have jobs. They are part of the community. And they also share those same concerns. Everyone is impacted by the blockade. It's not that there's some division between the Cuban leaders and the Cuban people. So they go in dialogue with them. But of course, the U.S. and its allies and its media apparatuses attempted to seize upon this moment of real economic hurt and real suffering of the people because of their own policies to try to say that, once and for all, the Cuban people are demanding freedom. And in a sense, they are demanding freedom from sanctions, freedom from U.S. imperialism. But that's really the story here is that, 4 years since the beginning of the global pandemic, where the entire world was on lockdown, where Cuba had the biggest economic recession in its history because tourism essentially went to zero, where it actually devoted all of its resources into caring for the people, into developing vaccines that have been used across the global south, into sending medical brigades to countries, not just in Africa and Latin America and Asia, but even to Europe, that they're still having, 4 years later, the economic impact of the pandemic, of the designation of the state sponsor of terror is having real impacts. And what they have been demanding, what the Cuban people have been demanding, is to let them breathe, to let them have the freedom to have economic transactions with whatever country and whatever company they want. So, that's really the root of the story here.
Yeah, and for the first time, just to give like an idea of the seriousness of the current shortages that Cuba's facing as a result of sanctions. And also we should remind people that like Trump added a ton of new sanctions on Cuba, and then Biden came in and added even more. And again, you mentioned it during a global pandemic, which had already like halted so much of the economic activity, particularly in global South countries that rely on tourism like Cuba does. But the Cuban government for the first time had to ask the UN World Food Program for help basically getting like dealing with its shortage of milk for children because it's running so low, and also of fuel and medicines. And Cuba's been dealing with medicine shortages for a while, despite the fact that it has a really great healthcare system because of U.S. sanctions. All that said, Zoe, I think there's something interesting that's happened as a result of what we're witnessing in Cuba right now, and the people talking about sanctions and the U.S. blockade is, and I'm not trying to make everything about Gaza, but I think what's happening in Gaza has really opened a lot of people's eyes because it's a reflection of the most extreme and depraved of U.S. imperial policies. And so when we look at Gaza, and then we look at other countries, Gaza's under a severe, obviously, like horrible blockade that's causing a famine that the U.S. is basically supporting right now. But it's really just an extreme version of what we've seen take place, not just against Gaza, but against Cuba, against Venezuela, against Iran, against North Korea, against all these countries at the mercy of these U.S. economic measures of war. And so I'm just curious, your thoughts on that, on the fact that when we talk about the Cuban blockade, we're talking about a kind of version of what we've seen, obviously, on a way bigger scale in a place like Gaza.
Yeah, I think that Gaza has opened people's eyes up to what imperialism really means and its tools. Of course, what we're seeing there is a genocide, which is the most extreme version of this, a genocidal war, bombings every day, atrocious violence, but the blockade has been in place against the people of Gaza for over 17 years. Obviously, that's also a tool of the Zionist project and of imperialism to deprive the people of their, basic means to survive with dignity. And this is a tool that's not just used against the people of Gaza, but of course, as you said, Rania, used against over 33 nations in the global South. 1/3 of the world's population is under some form of economic sanctions, and the majority of those are illegal because they were not approved by the United Nations. They were unilaterally imposed by the United States, by the EU member countries, and of course, in the case of Gaza, imposed by Israel. So, the tool of sanctions, of blockade, of economic siege, of using essentially the U.S. domination over the economic and financial global system to attempt to strangle a population, to deprive them, to give them only what they need to survive, but to essentially make that survival untenable. That's a clear tool of imperialism that's really used against the people of the world. And I think it's opening people's eyes up to the just unjust nature of this financial system, and the fact that the United States could essentially end all of these blockades. It could tomorrow say, okay, you know what? We're going to let the people of Cuba live with dignity. We're going to allow them to trade. And the fact that the U.S. has so much control over what happens in Israel's genocide in Gaza, the fact that it could just make one phone call with just one stroke of the pen end this, I think it really opens up people's eyes to its power and to its essentially lack of care and lack of respect and really caring about people's lives. So it's definitely a important case study to really show how imperialism works across the world. It works in uneven ways. It works in different ways that sometimes are hard to connect. But I think this has been such a clarifying moment to really understand that all of these things are connected, and they're connected by being targeted by imperialism.
Well, it's Interesting segue there for the next point I wanted to ask you about. Another country, of course, Venezuela, is heavily targeted. And even, in fact, today in the House of Representatives, I believe they did pass a bill to reauthorize sanctions against Venezuela. Now, of course, it'll have to go through the Senate and be signed by the president. But nonetheless, you can see that the pressure is building. And it's obviously building because Venezuela is getting ready to go to elections a little bit later this year. I mean, I think some people might even be surprised to hear that, Zoe, because we are always told that Venezuela is like an evil, anti-democratic, authoritarian dictatorship. But here we are yet again. Apparently the U.S. wants to see democracy in Venezuela. So why are they so upset that Venezuela is about to have elections?
Yeah, Venezuela has had, I think, over 20 elections since the Bolivarian Revolution started in 1999. So, talk about lack of democracy there. Essentially in the past couple of weeks, we've seen an intensification of U.S. attacks on Venezuela, not only through, official authorities, the House of Representatives today, but also through media and through the State Department, essentially around a key issue. So the U.S. has often used the moment of elections in Venezuela to say that Venezuela is corrupt, that it's a dictatorship, that there's no democracy. And this, of course, has to do with the element of who gets to participate in elections. And in this year, basically, the U.S. has already mounted their campaign to say that these elections are fraudulent around one key issue, which is the disqualification of a far-right opposition candidate who is Maria Corina Machado. She's been a figure in Venezuelan politics for decades now. Interestingly enough, she is the daughter of the former head of a steel company in Venezuela that was nationalized by Hugo Chavez. No sense of remorse or regret, or maybe a grudge there. But she has been in politics, again, for several decades, really with the sole purpose of overturning and overthrowing the Bolivarian Revolution. I'm sure your viewers already are familiar with the Venezuelan project, with the Bolivarian Revolution, but to give people a refresher, this is, started in the late 90s under the leadership of Hugo Chavez, with the basic idea that instead of, giving all of Venezuela's rich oil resources, mineral resources to transnational companies and getting very few royalties in return, or, filling the pockets of the rich elites in the country, why not use those resources to fund social programs, to give people access to education, to healthcare, to start things that then became called missions in the country. And these, social welfare programs, some might see them, were accompanied by a deep, engagement in politics. And so we see people like Maria Corina Machado, the son of a wealthy business owner, see that this kind of model is directly threatening her interests. And so she, over the past 2 decades, has essentially worked in every way possible to, as I said before, overthrow this project. She participated in the 2002 coup against Hugo Chavez. This saw kind of an interim government installed for 3 days, which was overthrown by popular protest. She signed the decree, swearing in this interim government. She later participates in not participates, but really gives political backing and support to the 2014 and 2017 Guarimba protests, which are these violent protests of far-right groups in Venezuela who are trying, in the aftermath of Hugo Chavez's death, to trying to spread unrest in the country, say that Nicolas Maduro cannot continue as leader of the country. In these Guarimba protests, for example, in 2017, over 100 people were killed. Many Chavistas were lynched, were tortured. People who were wearing red shirts were targeted by these Guarimba protesters. We're not just talking about people going on the street carrying placards and saying, we want, a raise in wages, or we're engaging in this political economic struggle. These are people who are, setting fire to buses, who are torturing people, and are really trying to create a situation of regime change. Machado then, following these Guarimba protests, which inevitably failed because the people united around the need for peace, she hops on the bandwagon of Juan Guaido and is part of, his parallel fictitious government participating in the different corruption schemes, which essentially stole Venezuelan money from the people. So she's someone who has been involved in regime change time after time and was banned actually from participating in the elections precisely because in order to participate in the electoral process, you have to not, due to an agreement made with the opposition, any candidate had to agree to not undermine and promote violence against the government. And she clearly was in violation of this. So she was banned from the elections. And this has been sort of the rallying flag for, these far-right regime change opposition sector, which is actually a quite marginal sector in Venezuela, but really has been capitalized by this, by U.S. politicians, by people like Maria Elvira Salazar, who has been, extremely vocal against Cuba and Venezuela. She was the one who passed this, attempt to reenact sanctions on Venezuela. So it's definitely a moment where the U.S. is starting to build its campaign against Venezuela. We know that in 2015, it said that in 2014, under Barack Obama, it declared Venezuela a threat to national security, something that has been renewed every year since then. And under this mandate they imposed the, suffocating regime of sanctions that was slightly loosened due to a political agreement last year. But again, this is the same script that Washington has been using to attack the Bolivarian Revolution for over 2 decades. And so once again, they're just trying to find, what piece is going to fit their narrative. And in this year, it's Maria Corina Machado, and they're just going to keep hammering on this point, ignoring the fact that, of course, she played a significant role in trying to overthrow the government, which for any democracy would mean that maybe you shouldn't be allowed to run for office.
You would think so, not to mention the fact that she conducted a totally fraudulent, quote-unquote, primary that even if you believe everyone they said voted, it was millions of people less than participated in the ruling party's primary. But either way, a lot to be said there. You are the co-editor of People's Dispatch, which has a great article co-written by yourself and Walter Smolarek on the Venezuela issue, and also some important updates vis-a-vis Cuba and everything that's been going on there. So peoplesdispatch.org. Hopefully I got that one right. Nonetheless, Zoe Alexandra, co-editor of People's Dispatch, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Eugene, since we like to travel around the world, one place to touch on is Niger, which just did something very interesting. That is, they basically said, America, shoo, take your base and go. Which I was like, damn, go Niger. It's impressive. First, they kicked out the French, which is what happened across the Sahel, which people should definitely go check out the episodes that I did on Dispatches with Eugene last year. There was a couple that we did specifically what was happening across West Africa with kicking out the French, kicking out the imperialists. And now, Niger has been home to this U.S. drone base. It's been very, very important for using across the region. To launch drone attacks, and now they're saying get out. So what's going on? Update us on what's happening with Niger.
No, of course, and I appreciate that shout out, and happy to actually be the highest rated guest for Dispatches of all time. Just want to put that out there.
You are the highest rated.
But nonetheless, yeah. I mean, I think it was kind of surprising because the U.S. basically the day before they kicked them out, the U.S. Had a delegation there, and it seemed like they had an okay meeting. And since the Nigerian sort of military popular uprising has taken place, the U.S. has been really trying to make nice with them. Molly Fee, of course, the Undersecretary of State for Africa, has been there several times. She's been trying to assure people it's all fine. We've got it all in hand. But it seems that what took place is that in the meeting itself, and this is just what we've been able to piece together, that the U.S. made some very strong demands towards Niger, basically telling them that they can't work with Russia and Iran, that they could be potentially sanctioned or penalized for that, questioning the relationships with Burkina Faso and Mali, of which this sort of multipolar cooperation is also a part of. And it seems that the Nigerian leadership at this point was not willing to accept the dictates from the United States about who they work with and who they don't work with. And so they decided that if the United States thought that having a base means they could dictate, that means that they have to go. So the Nigerian authorities right now have said that they're waiting for the United States to present a plan to them to leave. Now, if we can remember when they kicked the French out, there was a similar sort of situation here where, in fact, like hundreds of thousands of people had to protest every day in front of the main French base in Niamey or near there, which is the capital, because the French were like, well, we're just not going to leave because we don't recognize this government as legitimate, so we're just going to stay in classic colonialist fashion. So I suspect the U.S. will do whatever they can to try to find a way to stay, to see if they can walk it back. But as of now, it does in fact seem that they will be forced to leave. And this is an important domino because, obviously France, as the former colonial power of Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, large parts of Francophone Western Africa, is the, primary principal representative institution of the neo-colonial, just deprivation that people are faced. I mean, you think about a country like Niger, 43% of people live under less than $2 a day. 43% of people live under less than $2 a day. And I mean, if you think about that, the rural population, which is a large percentage of people there, 83% of them have no access to electricity whatsoever. But you look at a country like France, and I think the statistic is like something like 1 in 3 light bulbs in France is powered by uranium from Niger. I believe they're the second largest source. Sometimes they go back and forth with Kazakhstan. But you can see that their resources are basically used to keep the lights on in France, where the vast majority of Nigerians who are living in rural areas have no opportunity to have any lights on any time of the day, any day of the week, in addition to living in intense poverty, which a lot of which is related to things like the CFA franc, the neo-colonial currency that enriches countries that use the euro. So France and the European Union makes it easy for them to do business, but it also makes it harder to do different types of business, to develop industries, other things like that in Niger. So, kicking out France was really sort of the tip of the spear, but obviously the United States is very involved in maintaining this neo-colonial system in Africa. So, it was unclear what was going to take place. Understandable, you can't fight all the monsters at once necessarily. So I think many people felt, and I think the U.S. also felt, and France was actually criticizing the U.S. for this, that they could maybe dodge a bullet here by withdrawing all their troops from the capital and putting them in this drone base to the middle of nowhere in the desert, and hoping maybe that people would just kind of forget they were there and things would just sort of move on. But it seems that their hubris to dictate to Niger who they could be got them kicked out. And that, I think, Rania, speaks to the very character of these uprisings, because the United States, these fake rulers who were kicked out, the New York Times, the Economist, all these people, they're like, these are just military coups and this anti-democratic slide that's been happening all across Africa, when in fact these were immensely democratic events. These events took place because the people who live in Niger and Mali, Burkina Faso, I think we'll soon see vis-a-vis an election in Senegal, are tired of living generation after generation in poverty with no opportunities. I mean, we've talked about this before in the show. In China, they call the sort of colonial period, neo-colonial period there before the Chinese Revolution, the century of humiliation, the 100 years of humiliation. Well, Africa's had about 500 years of humiliation. And at this stage in the game, it's the youngest continent. 70% of the people are under the age of 35. They don't want to live like their parents, like their grandparents, and like their great-grandparents under this terrible situation. And the government of Niger that was kicked out, as their finance minister actually said just before they were kicked out, we're sitting on a social time bomb, and that if we don't make changes in the international global economy that allow us to lift people out of poverty, we will all be pushed out of power, we being these neo-colonial leaders in Africa. And that's what happened. Now, of course, there are probably many reasons why elements around the military and even elements of the political elite back these uprisings, but that's sort of a secondary issue. The reason they happen is because people are tired of living in poverty, and they're tired of living in a world where African countries are not allowed to have any sovereignty and are dictated to from capitals in Europe and the capital of the United States of America. And I think that is really what's behind this, is people said, the so-called, junta, as they call it in the U.S. media, basically said, we're not going to go like this anymore. Things have changed. And you can't tell us we can't work with Russia. We'll work with Russia if we want to. We'll work with Iran if we want to. And there's nothing you can do about it. And it shows, I think, how arrogant the U.S. is, that they weren't even asking them to leave. They were just saying, in addition to America, we're also going to work with our friends in Russia. We're also going to work with our friends in Iran. We're going to work with our friends in Africa. We're going to have an extensive, all-inclusive strategy to address, the quote-unquote terrorism issues that are happening in the country, to address poverty. They weren't even asking America to leave. They were actually saying, we'd like to have a partnership with you. So it shows you the arrogance of imperialism, that even when they have the opportunity to work with African nations in real partnership, they will reject it if those African nations refuse to essentially subordinate their own whims and interests to that of what Washington would like to see. So this is a massive issue. I think that, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, potentially what happens in the elections in Senegal. I mean, even the possibility here of Nigeria, which is, of course, an English-speaking country, a former British colony, which has very, very openly in the past couple of weeks started cozying up more to Russia and talking about how they want to buy weapons from them and work together on nuclear energy. And they've dropped all the sanctions on Niger, and now they're building a Chinese and African-funded railroad between Niger and Nigeria, and one of the most critical agricultural economic axes of those two countries, to try to create more opportunity for people who live there. So all of a sudden, the neo-colonial infrastructure that has kept Africans down for so many years and made so many white people in America and Europe so wealthy, and Australia for so many years, and quite frankly, sadly, the Gulf states too, for so many years, is now crumbling. It's crumbling. And all these countries are scrambling, to try to find a way to gain their purchase hold or their foothold, because Africans are there's a new wind in Africa. There's a new energy amongst Africans. And even the worst African leaders are so scared of their own people, they're starting to demand more from their partners in the West and other parts of the world that have really been exploiting Africa, quite frankly, for some time here now. And I think it's going to be a very interesting piece in the rest of this century to see the ripple effects of Africa getting up and standing on its own 2 feet. Because as Mao Zedong said in 1949, China stood on its own 2 feet when they had that revolution, and it changed the entire world. And I think Africans right now are going to change the entire course of the rest of this century. And you can see that this kicking out of the U.S., I think, is deeply indicative of that.
Well, let's certainly hope so. I mean, it is a really big deal. And this is, I think it got a lot of things that are happening right now are getting kind of lost internationally because the situation in Gaza is just like so horrific. This is a big deal. I'm sure the U.S. is freaking out. I just real quick, when we talk about U.S. drone base, if it actually happens, right? Because like you said, the U.S. is probably going to dig in its heels, but the U.S. drone base in Niger, what does it mean if they don't have it anymore?
Well, it's a very good point. And, the Pentagon has actually been very aggressively saying that this base is not that important to them all of a sudden. They spent hundreds of millions of dollars to build it. And the past couple of days, they've all been saying, it's not even that important. But, it's an interesting piece because what was happening there was not that clear in the first place. Very secret. The CIA was operating a drone program there in addition to the U.S. military. JSOC, the special forces, seem to be using that as a forward operating base in different ways. And so it seems like that base was a real node for, covert operations all around the African continent, certainly in the Sahelian region. And this is one of the things that Africans in this area have been questioning quite a bit is, what are they really doing in this base and what is it really about? But they spent hundreds of millions of dollars to set it up. They have all their most secret units there. They have the CIA there using the base in some way. So it seems to me that this base is a major instrument of power projection, coercion, also probably the use of intelligence gathering as a coercive measure in and of itself. Like, we have all this intelligence, we're flying around, we have all these drones, we can tell all you countries around here what's going on with ISIS, what's going on with Al-Qaeda, and if you don't work with us, you won't really know what's happening. So the ability to use sort of a broker information. And I suspect that a lot of, black ops that we probably won't know exactly what happened until 30 or 40 years from now are being run out of there into various African countries under, for who even knows what they're doing. But also, given where it is, it's possible that it's projecting into other sort of areas that are both African and in the sort of the eastern part of the Sahel, you might say, which is also closer to West Asia. I suspect there's some elements going on there. There may actually be a tie-in into Palestine in some ways, because Sudan has traditionally been a vector for various arms for the Palestinian resistance. So it also might be used in that area to sort of manage what's happening there. There's all sorts of different issues. I will tell you this, and then I'll close on this point. Many people in Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso believe that France and the United States were actually using these bases to create sort of false flag terrorist events. Now, of course, in the U.S. media, that's called a conspiracy theory, but I can tell you it's widely held in Africa. So the very secrecy of the base in and of itself, I think, lets you know that something important was happening there. And if they don't have it, it would be, I think, a significant blinding of the U.S. offensive capability militarily, of its black ops capability inside of Africa, and of its intelligence gathering capabilities inside of Africa, which means it'll be much harder for the U.S. to actually coerce African governments to do what they want to do by bringing this sort of full spectrum dominance to bear on them.
Well said. Well said. Well, we have to sit and watch and see what takes place, but it's huge. I mean, I don't think it should be understated. Not that I'm saying you are, but just the enormity of a country like Niger telling America to GTFO. That's right.
Indeed.
Family programming here, so I've acronymed. But
I appreciate that. We are family friendly here at Breakthrough News.
But also I do encourage people to, if you're not already doing it, make sure you follow Breakthrough News on all your social media platforms. I believe we did post the video of the announcement of the leadership in Niger announcing that they want the Americans to leave. And that sort of thing is very important to go hear directly from from the leadership, because you're not going to see that in the New York Times and the Washington Post. They're going to maybe give a quote here and there, and then they're going to call these people, coup leaders, is how they'll put it. And that's another reason why you should go to patreon.com/breakthrough news and become a member of Breakthrough News if you can. Help support the show, help support all of our programming and journalism here, so we can bring you what the New York Times and Washington Post and CNN certainly will not.
That's 100% sure. One of those things certainly is, the very important updates that we're consistently getting from the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research that help us understand the world around us quite well. And we are very honored to be joined as we move into our next topic by the executive director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, and that's Dr. Vijay Prashad, to talk with us about one of their new very important texts, Hyper-Imperialism. Vijay, thank you so much for being with us.
It's great to be with you, and I'm so glad that I'm coming to you right after your conversation about that drone base in Agadez, Niger, which I've seen when I traveled through that region. And it's quite interesting because it's on the road, Eugene, to Arlit, where the uranium mines are. So it plays an interesting role, not the least of which as a line of defense, for Europe, because it's actually an anti-migrant base as much as anything. It's very interesting that they located it right there.
That actually is quite interesting.
It's a coincidence, guys. No, it's a coincidence. Stop. You sound like some crazy, kooky conspiracy nuts. They just picked that place because the weather's nice.
Well, it's interesting because it's the last point in Niger, almost the last point in Niger, where migrants from West Africa basically gather in Agadez, get ready to board, mostly white Toyota trucks, and drive through the Sahara to Sabah, Libya. So in fact, it is on the exact route of the migration to Libya and then to Lampedusa. So this town is really significant for that. And I mean, that's precisely why the US has that drone base there. Also, it's really interesting that, you guys followed the killing of US servicemen in Western Niger about 2 years ago. There was a little bit of a scandal. People said, well, we didn't even know there were US troops in Niger. Well, but the US troops are there to basically fight Al-Qaeda, which in that region is largely smugglers. And they smuggle, things like cigarettes. That's a huge market across the Sahara. But they also smuggle people. They smuggle weapons. They smuggle drugs. Cocaine is a big item smuggled through there. And the US government has increased its presence. And when I wrote about this, I mentioned that for the United States and Europe, the European border moved from north of the Mediterranean to south of the Sahara. And when the French developed G5 Sahel, the 5 countries of the Sahel into this so-called axis, the United States positioned a drone base, the 10-year lease expiring this year, as like an, manage the arc to stop migration, people going from what Bossel's called the jungle to the garden. There's not much conversation about the role of this base in that regard, in terms of anti-migration and anti-smuggling and so on. I mean, the cocaine story, guys, is for another conversation, because I don't know if you know, it's a major source of Latin American cocaine going through the Sahara back to the United States. Very weird.
Yeah, no, and Guinea-Bissau, of course, right now, a lot of that is playing out in the politics there. But no, very, very, very good point. But a relevant point, the military point that you bring up, Vijay, about hyper-imperialism. I think one of the main things that actually I think that is laid out in the text, and talk to us about the text, is in fact the role of the U.S. and European this massive military machine in attempting to, keep the thumb on the scale of the entire world.
Well, the first thing to say, which I think is important, is just the numbers. The flagship organization that counts military spending numbers is known as SIPRI, the Stockholm Institute. Well, they've been doing this for many years, and they have a methodology. Part of the methodology is that they accept the numbers that the government gives them. So the United States numbers for the Defense Department is the number for SIPRI. But of course, we know and have known for a very long time that a lot of U.S. military spending is not in the Department of Defense. It's in the Department of Energy. It's in, of course, the Department of Veterans Affairs, because you've got to count, the expenditure on troops who've been injured as part of military spending, because that's what it is. But really, the Department of Energy subsection, which goes to the nuclear weapons program, is considerable. So what the count found when we looked at the actual numbers, it's not near 1 trillion, near 1 trillion, 900 billion or so. It's about 1.53 trillion. It's much more than that. And that increases the quantum of spending of the global north. That is the United States, its NATO partners, and then the NATO plus countries, Republic of Korea, South Korea, Japan, and so on. When you add them all up, the share of global military spending by the United States and its main partners, it's 75% of world spending. Compare that to China at 12%. I mean, it's apples and oranges. And what we, building on that, that's a good factual assessment. And by the way, I would like to offer the researchers at SIPRI to have an open and frank and friendly debate about the numbers, because I think, we would like them to reconsider the way they count U.S. military spending. So this is not a challenge or anything like that. That's not the kind of person I am, but I would like to have an open and friendly debate with them on the numbers that we have come up with. But the implications for this, Eugene, are considerable, because, what's interesting? What's interesting is what a CIA bureau chief of Tehran before the revolution told me, Chuck Kogan. He told me, if you have a hammer, and if you have a really big hammer, everything looks like a nail. That means any problem in the world, the first solution isn't going to be diplomacy. It's going to be to hammer it. And this is particularly so of people that the Western countries, the global north, sees as beneath them. So for instance, the government of Yemen made a declaration saying, hey, listen, we want to support the Palestinians. They are undergoing a genocide. So we are going to try to prevent shipping through the Red Sea. And, Rania, if you look at a map, the Red Sea is pretty narrow. So where Yemeni territorial waters go out, it's very hard for ships to actually completely avoid Yemeni territorial waters. That means that the government of Yemen says, we're going to exercise sovereignty. We're going to, hit at ships that are carrying weapons to Israel. If Yemen was any other country, then Antony Blinken or a subordinate would have flown into Sana'a, would have met the political leadership of the Yemeni government, the main political party, Ansar Allah, would have discussed with them, hey, listen, we don't think it's a good idea, global shipping, blah, 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 we don't know what's carrying what, and started a diplomatic conversation. But no, because the global north sees certain countries basically as what an Israeli called human savages, you just hit them immediately. That you have a big hammer and you see them as a nail and bam, Sudan, 1996, the Clinton administration, United States, decided that Sudan had been party to the bombing of the embassies in East Africa, US embassies. Maybe that was true, but there was no visit to Khartoum to go and discuss with the government of Umar al-Bashir what's the situation. Instead, send in missiles and destroy the only factory in Africa that produced drugs for malaria, the Al-Shifa factory. Or Afghanistan, 2001, there's an attack on the United States Pentagon, World Trade Center and so on. The Taliban government says, we want to negotiate. Here's the white flag of Pali. Can we talk? No. Smack them down. So, this idea, I've just given you 3 examples. If you have a big enough hammer, the whole world looks like a nail. And right now, the global north has such a big hammer that it can blow up any bridge in the world, any bridge, but it doesn't know how to build them. It can blow up any bridge, but they're not going to build them. And I think that's an important point, is that the global north right now is able to exercise violence against the world, but it's not able to exercise leadership. And that's why the world is right now scoffing at the United States or France. And that's why the government of Niger says, we need you out of here.
Okay, so Vijay, what you just described sounds very dark and scary. What are the possibilities then, right? Like if we're moving, into an emerging sort of multipolar world where, and not just multipolar, I mean, you have a global south that is starting to create institutions not necessarily can stand up to the imperialism of the global north, but certainly present alternative avenues for dealing in certain ways when it comes to at least like economics, let's say. So what can we look forward to in the present and into the near future, at least in terms of alternatives and ways to counter the very scary forces that you just described?
Well, first, let's recognize that these very scary forces have contradictions. The United States and its allies haven't really won a war in decades. They were defeated in Iraq, defeated in Afghanistan. Libya was hardly a victory. Okay, you blew up the country, and then what did you don't dominate it, you don't control it. It was a loss. The Israelis cannot win in Gaza. There's no way. They can destroy all of Gaza, they can kill a lot of Palestinians, but they can't win. Why? Because the global north, including Israel, which is a part of the global north, they don't have a project. They don't have a way to envision their own leadership. They know what they're against, but they're not sure what they are for. You can't win in the world merely by exercising force, domination. What are you for? What do you want to build? They still have the austerity agenda on the table. Nobody wants austerity. But I also don't want to exaggerate. If I'm not exaggerating the as you said, the scary stuff, because there are contradictions there. They just can't win. And I think they realize that, they know that. On the other side, I don't want to exaggerate the emergence of the new. It's very, very much, very early days. They're sort of stumbling. There's a lot of stumbling happening. What we're seeing in the Sahel is one, episode of stumbling. These governments that have come in are trying to, negotiate with each other. There are many landlocked countries. It's hard to manage a landlocked country's economy. They're making various alliances. They're getting threatened. The BRICS bloc is filled with internal contradictions. You have countries that have for decades despised each other. What is Iran and Saudi Arabia going to do despite the handshake agreement in China? How are they going to relate to each other? When you look at even things like the Group of Friends in Defense of the UN Charter, which was set up by the Venezuelan government around sanctions, Angola has walked out of that. They are making new deals with the United States around the Lobito corridor to effectively undermine the Democratic Republic of Congo and take out raw materials to a port in Angola. So there's a great stress and strain taking place in the global south. And I'm not prepared to exaggerate the developments. I'm okay with saying there's a new mood in the global south. There's a kind of confidence, a new language. Anwar Ibrahim's extraordinary comment standing next to Olaf Scholz is an example of that. A Malaysian prime minister talking with so much confidence, speaking for the world, against the Chancellor of Germany, dismissing the Chancellor of Germany. That's a new mood. I think in Sahel, when they say, French out and then US out and so on, that's part of the new mood. But then what happens tomorrow? What happens after they're out? You just lost $600 million, Niger, of US government financing. What happens tomorrow? You're a landlocked country. Who are you going to sell your uranium to? If you're going to sell your uranium to the Russians, how long will your government last? Because the hammer is sitting above your head and it might rest heavily, not only on Agadez, the city of the bases, but on Arlit, which is effectively the uranium base. So we're at a moment of real stresses and strains and unpredictability. And I think for people who want a better world, unpredictability means you got to be wary of your politics. You can't have too many certainties. You have to be ready to tack one way or the other. It's like, I suppose, when you're in a storm in the sea and you have to be careful of where the winds are so your ship doesn't go in the wrong direction. You have to be very aware. So I'm cautious about certainties right now. I think we're not in a moment of certainty. We're in a moment of a great deal of churning, which is the word that we use to describe the world in our dossier from January, which is the churning of the global order.
Yes, well, we'll lash ourselves to the mast so that we are not taken off track by the sirens. But, one of the points I also want to ask you on this point is, we talk so much about a multipolar world, but, are popular movements in and of themselves a pole? Like, we talk about the context so much purely just of states, but I wonder what you think about the role of popular movements and how the world is being shaped.
See, it's very clear that, firstly, let's just say, for the record on this show, that the protest movements taking place in the global north have been extraordinary. The very fact that the Canadian government has said now that they will not supply arms to Israel is a tribute not to Justin Trudeau, who's a weak-kneed, quite pathetic leader of that country. It's a tribute to the people's movement that has changed the tide in Canada. So, the example of what's happening in Canada, which is really a pretty wretched country, more than 70% of the world's mining companies are domiciled in Canada. So it's not like it's some liberal paradise, okay? These are vicious mining companies like Barrick Gold and so on, all domiciled in Canada. But Canada, because of this popular pressure, has had to basically reconsider its full-throated support for Israel. I think that's a very good example for people around the world. But let's look now at the global south briefly. Take the case of Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, and so on. The people who've come to power in these countries, the young officers who are in power, Ibrahim Kote and others, they play an important role. They have a certain understanding of what they don't want. But it's not yet clear that they have an understanding of what they want. What's the agenda on the table? For a lot of time in the 20th century, from the coup of Abdul Karim Qasim in Iraq in 1958, to, in fact, the later coups in Africa in the 1960s and 70s, many of these military people that came to power, and Qasim is a good example, they didn't know what to do the day after. They knew what they were coupping. They were against that government. But what happens tomorrow? Qasim turns to the Iraqi Communist Party and says, please give me a hand. And that's exactly what they did. So in that sense, what I'm trying to say in a sort of roundabout way is that the movements play a very important role laying out an agenda for these countries where a new mood has begun to set in. You can't allow Anwar Ibrahim of Malaysia. You can't allow the South African government led by Ramaphosa. You can't allow the military in Niger to set the terms because, in a sense, they are yesterday's thinkers. They think about the agenda from yesterday's point of view. They now know that they are against austerity and that they are against, United States interference in their politics, but they don't know what they should be for. And that's where the movements come in. That's what the movements put on the agenda. The movements are going to have to say that we need you immediately to basically help us transcend the everyday needs of people. We need electricity. We need, literacy. We need better medical care. We need to no longer be hungry. Things like that have to be on the agenda. And then new leaders will appear, or maybe the old leaders will transform themselves. Maybe Mr. Museveni in Uganda will figure out that he used to be a Marxist in his youth, a student of Walter Rodney in Tanzania. Maybe Museveni will say miraculously, okay, I reject the austerity agenda. He's been saying some pretty radical things around the wars in the world these days. But what if these people or new people emerge saying, we need an agenda where the wealthy bondholders sitting in the West shouldn't be the first beneficiaries of our wealth, but the first beneficiaries of our wealth should be our own people. So how are you going to deal with the wealthy bondholders? Are you prepared for a frontal fight? Is there going to be a block of countries joining together to contest the immense burden of debt on the African continent, as per example? So that's the role the movements have to play, because we know these new leaders, we know that they are against yesterday, but we also know that they don't know what tomorrow will look like.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, as always, Vijay, it is a pleasure to have you here. I hope everyone checks out Hyper-Imperialism, which you can see at the website of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research in PDF form as well, so you can print it out and read it in hard copy, which you can also get as well. Vijay Prashad, thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Always a pleasure to be on the Freedom Side.
Thank you, sir. Rania? Oh, you're muted.
There I am. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem.
I was messing with my AC. Sorry. I always mute so you don't hear the beeping sound.
Respect.
Anyways, I was saying you're so formal. You said, thank you, sir.
Well, listen, there's a longer discussion to be had about that, which we will have at another time.
Oh, okay. I didn't know. Yes. Wow. Okay. I didn't mean to jump into that, but I know that we want to move on. So we'll have to save that conversation for another time.
We will indeed. We will indeed. Well, we want to turn our attention here to the ongoing genocide, occupation, apartheid. We could go on and on with terrible words. What's being done to the Palestinian people by the Israeli occupation with the help of the U.S. government. We are very, very honored to be joined here on the show as we move into this topic by Dr. Mustafa Barghouti. Dr. Barghouti, thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for hosting me.
Well, the pleasure is all ours. And I want to start, we're getting a lot of news here today in the United States about Antony Blinken's travels around the West Asian region and all the claims that they are making that the United States is trying to, in his words, bring an enduring end to the genocide in Gaza. I wonder what you make of these efforts coming from the U.S. government recently in the UN and these various capitals. I mean, are they truly working for peace or what?
Absolutely not. I think the United States of America is unfortunately complicit in these war crimes, not just complicit, but actually participating in them by providing Israel with weapons. 28,000 tons of explosives have been supplied by the United States to Israel, which has thrown on Gaza no less than 70,000 tons of explosives, which is about 30 kilograms of explosives for every man, woman, and child in Gaza. The United States has just changed its position in the United Nations Security Council one more time. Instead of supporting a resolution for an immediate ceasefire, they're talking now about the necessity of a resolution about ceasefire, but not supporting ceasefire. And that is, of course, very alarming. But in addition to that, unfortunately, we see continuous acceptance of Israeli arguments and support to the Israeli point of view. And a very good example of that is that the United States' decision to suspend completely any support to UNRWA till 2025. This resolution means suffocating UNRWA and trying to liquidate the rights of the Palestinian refugees by killing UNRWA. So practically what the United States is doing is punishing the victim instead of punishing the aggressor and the killer in this case.
Dr. Barghouti, one thing that the U.S. has also been doing, which isn't new, I mean, this is kind of what the U.S. does around the world, and that is, they have these discussions about, they talk about the day after, or even now. And when they talk about the Palestinian political scene, they're searching anywhere to find some sort of leader that they can get behind, right? That's, I mean, as they do anywhere. And right now you do see like polls showing that there's a huge rise in certain areas, at least, where it can be polled in support for a group like Hamas, which the US completely refuses to allow, and of course the Israelis as well, to be any part of the Palestinian political arena, and allow a decreased support for the Palestinian Authority. And so I'm curious if you can maybe lay out a bit, when we talk about the Palestinian political scene, what do you see as the way forward? And maybe that's a difficult thing to talk about in the midst of a genocide unfolding right now. But at the same time, Palestinians do need some sort of unity that involves all players, you would think. So I guess, what are your thoughts on all of that as the U.S. tries to influence or even control whatever the future Palestinian leadership is made up of?
Thank you. Before I respond to your question, which is a very important one, I would like to alert you also to the so-called talks about a new port that the United States is working on to provide supplies, as they say. The first question here is, why do we need a port that will need months to be built? Meanwhile, people will die because of starvation in the north of Gaza. Why do we need that while Israel could easily allow thousands of trucks of aid on the Egyptian side, and it would take them only 15 minutes to get from one side to the other, providing the necessary food and milk and flour and medications to the Palestinian population, which is starving now. Because the United States does not want to pressure Israel to allow these supplies to get in. But more than that, and that's the most dangerous element, it seems that the United States is also complicit with Mr. Netanyahu, who just declared 2 days ago that he wants to use the port to deport Palestinians, to evict Palestinians. His plan of ethnic cleansing never ceased away, and he continues to dream about that act of ethnic cleansing of all Palestinians from Gaza. Now, in response to your question about Palestinian politics, look, there are two versions here, or two points of view. One point is what the Americans are supporting, and that is more civilization of an already securitized Palestinian Authority. They want a structure that serves Israel's interest. All they want is a huge security apparatus, regardless of the fact that the existing security apparatus in the Palestinian Authority is already consuming 40% of the budget of the PA, and taking the resources away from health and education and and social welfare. And it is unable to protect Palestinians from any settler, any terrorist settler, or from any Israeli soldier. And during the last 24 hours, the Israeli army killed 14 Palestinians in the West Bank, more than 440 since 7th of October, and the Palestinian Authority could not prevent one single death of those. So why do they need more security structure? Just to serve Israel's interest. And it is interesting here what Biden said when he said that we need a Palestinian leadership that is acceptable to Israel. Did he say that we need an Israeli leadership that is acceptable to Palestinians? Of course not. The funny thing here is that the United States of America speaks about democracy everywhere, about Serbia, Russia, China maybe, Ukraine and other places, and about democratic free elections except in Palestine. They don't want us to have our right of democratically electing our leaders. And that's why the United States was not supportive of us having elections in 2021. Our view as Palestinians, and that's the Palestinian way in our opinion, is that we need to keep the right of the Palestinian people to represent themselves by sustaining the PLO. But the problem is that the leadership of the PLO is not really representative of all Palestinians. And that's why we are calling for a unified Palestinian leadership within the ranks of the PLO. And that's what we agreed about in Moscow in a most recent meeting of all the 14 Palestinian political forces. And we agreed on a communique that said that everybody should be allowed in the PLO so that the PLO becomes the representative of all Palestinians. Along these lines, we should have a national consensus government that would unify West Bank and Gaza Strip, prevent Israel from consolidating its occupation of Gaza, and that would be an interim government, but accepted by all political forces. An interim because it has to prepare for free democratic elections that we should have had in 2021. All the polls that came out yesterday and the polls that we had in 2020 and 2021 were showing the same thing. No single party in Palestine can get majority, and that's why we will need a unified national front and a more pluralistic democratic system. As you can see, we are talking about two different versions. The Palestinian Authority committed a big mistake by going in the direction of what the Americans want, by appointing a prime minister without consultation with all the groups that met in Moscow, and and paving the road for forming a government without national consensus. And that is, in my opinion, a big mistake, besides the fact that such a government will not be able actually to function without the acceptance of the Palestinian people.
We're facing this, Israeli threat to potentially blow up Al-Shifa Hospital. They've, I believe, blown up every single university in Gaza already. I mean, can you talk about the impact and perhaps the goals of Israel in attacking so many, the healthcare infrastructure, the educational infrastructure, and so many other critical parts of Palestinian civil society?
Well, Israel already blew up big parts of Al-Shifa Hospital, which is the largest hospital in Palestinian territories. They've already destroyed the surgical department, or the surgical hospital, actually. It's the largest and main surgical facility in the Gaza Strip. They blew it up completely, and in the process, they killed 200 people. The rest of the hospital is now besieged and surrounded by the Israeli army. And many civilians who were in the vicinity of that hospital were forced to be evicted. Why Israel destroys 75% of the people's homes and all universities and 31 hospitals out of 36 hospitals in Gaza Strip, and in addition to more than 100 health centers, more than 150 ambulances, most schools. They destroyed all the infrastructure, electricity infrastructure, water infrastructure, as well as sewage systems. Their goal is to make Gaza uninhabitable, to make it impossible for people to live in Gaza. Because the main goal of this Israeli campaign has been, from the very beginning, the eviction of people from Gaza to Sinai, to conduct ethnic cleansing. And the explanation to that is very simple. There are 7 million Palestinians today on the land of historic Palestine. It is a bit bigger than the number of Jewish Israelis on the same land. The solution to that is only one of two possibilities. Either two-state solution, where Israel would withdraw from the occupied Palestinian territories in West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, allow a Palestinian state to be established, or one democratic state where we will all live together in one democratic system with equal rights. And that state, of course, cannot be Jewish only, as Israel wants. But Israel does not want two-state solution and does not want one-state solution. So what is their solution? Ethnic cleansing. That's exactly what they've been trying to do in Gaza. That's why they destroyed the whole infrastructure of Gaza. And that's why they are trying to push people and to evict them out of Gaza.
I think the perfect encapsulation of that was this recent comment we saw by Jared Kushner, the son-in-law of Donald Trump. I'm sure you saw that, of him saying, oh yeah, Gaza, it's really unfortunate what's happening, but it's great beachfront property. We should build some luxury condos there. And it really is just the most disgusting way. Yeah. It evicts people. It's incredible to hear it that way, but it really is these rich people in suits sitting there salivating over the thought of beachfront property and of getting rid of the natives. And I guess I want to ask you something that I ask a lot of people when it comes to watching this genocide in Gaza unfold, and also the horrific violence in the West Bank that, if there wasn't a genocide in Gaza, would be front page news, because it is horrific, the violence taking place in the West Bank. It just, the scale doesn't seem as big. But are you, you obviously know, you've known your whole life what Israel stands for and what the Zionist project seeks to do. That said, are you surprised at all by how depraved the violence in Gaza has been, by the videos that Israeli soldiers are taking of themselves and proudly posting online to celebrate the murder, the mass murder that they're carrying out, again, quite proudly, and just the level of hate that has consumed this very brainwashed society that is collectively celebrating the starvation of a population, half of which is under the age of 18. Does any of it surprise you?
I'm not surprised, but at the same time, I have to say that what we see is the result of transformation in Israel towards fascism. Nothing less than that. And it started, of course, the Zionist ideology, the whole Zionist project is a settler colonial project. Israel was created by committing 52 massacres in 1948 and by erasing to the ground 520 Palestinian communities and villages and forcing 70% of the Palestinian population out of their land. The difference between 1948 and what Israel is doing today is that today we can see what they are doing. In 1948, the world could not see what was happening and maybe did not know about what has happened. And because of the Israeli strong propaganda, the world, big parts of the world were misled about what really happened in 1948. So they committed a crime and could hide it. Today, the crime is there. It's clear. It's everywhere. You can see, I mean, if you want to know, you can know. And regardless of the fact that mainstream media shied away during the last 2 months from us, still the information gets there through social media. So the question is, what surprised me? What surprised me is the fact that the world is accepting that. What surprised me is that for a long time, we believed what we were told by many Western countries and governments about democracy, human rights, international law, respect of international law. They even had the guts to send, to create programs of training Palestinians in respecting issues of democracy and human rights. And look what they are doing now. They are allowing Israel to commit this terrible genocide, allowing Israel to commit all these war crimes, and doing nothing. Not only doing nothing, some of them are participating in these crimes. Some of them are sending soldiers to help Israel. Many of them are sending weapons to Israel, sending their planes to fly over Gaza like Britain, sending their experts like the United States to help the Israelis. This surprised me. It means that it means that we do not live by international law in the 21st century. And that means that the world community is living according to the law of jungle. And actually, one person criticized me for using the word law of jungle, saying that I am insulting animals by saying so. Because animals don't kill just to kill, like the Israelis do. And that's the reality of what we face today. When the world accepts a person like Gallant, who is the Minister of Defense in Israel, saying that Palestinians are human animals, and when they accept Netanyahu's talk continuously about evicting Palestinians, that is a strange world, and it is really surprising how they did accept that and allow it to continue.
And Dr. Barghouti, one final question here, as someone who has been a longtime leader in the Palestinian movement. I'm sure you've seen many different manifestations, of course, of international solidarity with the Palestinian people. Many of the people who are viewers of our program have been involved in the protest and other actions happening in the United States. I think many people, though, seeing the ongoing genocide, are wondering, do they matter? Do their actions matter? Is it important for them to keep coming out and taking this? And I wonder what your message would be to those who are showing solidarity with Palestine here in the United States.
I have actually two messages. First message is that, yes, of course, it matters. What you do matters, and it makes an impact. And it is our hope. Please continue that and increase it, actually. We've seen how many governments had to change their policy under the pressure of their people. Look at Canada. Who would have expected that Canada would not only bring back the funding to UNRWA, but also suspend and stop supplying Israel with weapons? That's a big step forward. And the public demonstrations and is not only encouraging Palestinians and providing them with moral support, but also they are changing the positions of many governments in New Zealand, in Australia, in France, and so many other places. But we need more of that. And we specifically need more of that in the United States of America, where this is the place where we need to exercise even more pressure and more demonstrations, and explaining to Biden that he will definitely lose elections if he continues this policy, and threatening him with that, actually. But the other thing I want to say is that I want to assure you that nothing in this Israeli behavior, nothing in these Israeli crimes that are committed against us will break our will or our insistence to get our freedom. Nothing will break the Palestinian people's determination to stay on their land, achieve their freedom, achieve our goals. The people are absolutely heroic in Gaza especially, but everywhere also in Palestine. And this heroism will continue. I'm so proud of our people. I'm so proud of our ability to tolerate all this injustice and still fight for justice and for our freedom. And I promise you, we will never give up. We will continue till we get our freedom.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Mustafa Barghouti, it's really been an honor. Thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you so much, Zair.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, that was really moving. And I think that we have to listen to those words. He's right. The people of Gaza, the people of Palestine are incredibly heroic, incredibly brave. And if they can keep going, so can those of us in more comfortable situations keep doing everything in our power to end this genocide in whatever capacity we have.
No, 100%. And I think that's critically important. And, obviously it's late there in Palestine, so I didn't want to give a whole long thing. For people don't know, Dr. Mustafa Barghouti is with the Palestinian National Initiative. He actually was the only person who ran for president against Mahmoud Abbas many years ago. But he's played a major role in trying to bring together all of the Palestinian factions from all the different backgrounds over a long period of time to help strengthen the movement there. So very, very august voice there in the movement of Palestinian people. So we were really honored that he was willing to join. I also just want to shout out Ahmed, Josh, and Omar for your donations during the past couple interviews. Really appreciate everybody who contributes in any way, shape, or form here to us at Breakthrough News. It really is greatly, greatly appreciated. So I appreciate you three, Ahmed, Josh, and Omar, who pitched in here today. Rania, I think as always, this brings us to the end of our show. But before we get out of here, are there any things you would like to leave our viewers with?
Yes, Eugene, as usual. First of all, thank you again for everybody for smashing that like button. But I want to encourage you, if you haven't already, to smash that like button.
Smash that like button.
I love it. It helps boost us in the algorithm. Wait, what is that? Birds chirping? Okay. I could go with that. I like it. It confuses me about the time of day, but I like it. Anyways, definitely do make sure that you like the show, subscribe to the show. But also, if you want to help support the show materially, you can become a member of Breakthrough News by going to patreon.com/breakthrough news, where you can help support independent media as well as get access to exclusive content and some very cool exclusive merch. So highly encourage you, if you are able to do that. Once again, independent media like this is, I think, more important than ever in this moment in time, as we're up against a tsunami of constant disinformation from a corporate media apparatus that wants to cover up genocide, as well as cover up the sanctions that are destroying the world and pretend like capitalism is awesome when it sucks. So patreon.com/breakthrough news. That's my spiel, Eugene.
Indeed. Well, hey, you guys spend money to make money. So trust me, we will eliminate the money economy if Breakthrough News can actually become, one of the biggest media outlets on the planet. So you'll get your payoff at the end of the day. Your debts will be gone. You'll have free health care. It's just a little bit of paying it forward. Nonetheless, shout out to all of our guests. Of course, thank you so much. All of our viewers, as always, everyone on the Breakthrough News team who helps make the show possible. And for myself, for Rania, we will see you next time.